In the damp treasury at Westminster, a heavy iron-bound chest of English gold nobles is counted out under a flickering torch. The siege of Harfleur 1415 begins not with a glorious cavalry charge, but with the terrifying roar of massive gunpowder artillery bombards named London and the King's Daughter. King Henry V stakes his royal crown on this single Norman port, confident the walls will collapse within days. What rises from the drained marshes instead will prove deadlier than French steel. And before the campaign is over, the question will not be whether the town falls, but whether the king himself can survive. Domestic rebellions and Welsh insurgencies leave the new Lancastrian dynasty with a fragile, highly contested claim to the English throne. To unite his fractured nobility, Henry looks across the Channel during this fractured era of the 100 Years' War. The massive coastal fortification of Harfleur boasts 2.5 miles of thick stone walls and 26 solid masonry towers. This wealthy maritime stronghold is protected by defenses that the French consider entirely impregnable. A treacherous, marshy river valley guards its northern flank, presenting a mathematically devastating obstacle to any invading army. French ambassadors offer an expanded territory in Aquitaine, but for the proud English king, this counter-proposal is a deliberate mockery of his royal birthright. Parliament swiftly grants a double subsidy to fund a campaign of absolute territorial conquest. A massive fleet of 1,500 transport vessels gathers at Southampton, their tall wooden hulls crowding the harbour waters. Henry V decides to invest Harfleur to establish a permanent English gateway into Normandy. He believes that God has ordained his conquest of France, and that the port will collapse within a matter of days. On a slate-grey morning, hundreds of flat-bottomed wooden boats grate against the shingle beach of Chez de Caux, just 3 miles west of the town. To the king's immense relief, the landing of 11,000 professional combatants is completely unopposed. English men-at-arms and Welsh longbowmen shuttle thousands of panicked, shivering horses onto the French shoreline. As the invaders encircle the walls, a legendary and highly experienced French knight arrives to alter the balance. Raoul de Gaucourt slips through the incomplete lines with 300 heavily armed men-at-arms, immediately assuming absolute command of the garrison. Raoul de Gaucourt expects the massive walls and water defenses to buy enough time for a royal rescue. He watches from the high ramparts as his garrison tightens its grip on the 3 fortified stone gatehouses. The French knights check their heavy iron portcullises and adjust their thick wooden barbicans as the enemy approaches. He assumes that the Dauphin's royal army gathering at Rouen will inevitably arrive to break the English siege before the town's defenses completely disintegrate. It is a fatal miscalculation based on an old style of warfare that ignores English determination. The French commander acts with immediate ruthless efficiency to break the initial English deployment strategy. De Gaucourt orders the heavy wooden sluice gates of the Lézarde River closed, trapping the rising waters. A vast, brackish lake quickly swallows the low-lying valley floor, effectively splitting the invading army in two. Henry reacts instantly, without a single moment of hesitation. He commands his brother, the Duke of Clarence, to take a massive detachment on a perilous, miles-long detour around the new lake, completely dividing his forces before a single weapon is fired in open combat. The low-lying valley floor is a maze of stagnant pools, thick mud, and rotting river vegetation under a humid, late-summer sun. This treacherous landscape isolates the two English camps, leaving them intensely vulnerable to a sudden, coordinated French sally. Soldiers wade through waterlogged trenches, their leather boots caked in heavy Norman clay. The magnificent siege engines must be dragged through sucking mires to reach their firing positions. Every man in the trenches feels a growing sense of isolation as the dark stone towers of Harfleur loom silently above the rising water. 12 colossal bronze and iron cannons are systematically positioned in heavily fortified batteries facing the western walls. The gunners erect massive timber screens to shield themselves from a constant rain of French crossbow bolts. A heavy, breathless silence settles over the marshy fields as the burning match hovers inches above the touch hole. Among these monstrous gunpowder weapons are 3 exceptionally large bombards resting on thick wooden beds embedded deep in the mud. The crews load hand-carved limestone spheres weighing up to 400 pounds into the dark barrels, preparing for devastation. The first massive detonation shatters the morning silence, but the grand plan for a swift, decisive victory collapses almost immediately. Henry's engineers tunnel beneath the outer dry moat, but the alert French garrison places copper bowls of water on the ground to pinpoint the exact locations. Countermines crash through the clay, and terrified miners fight hand-to-hand with daggers in pitch-black spaces barely 3 feet high. The French repel the attackers with boiling water and wildfire. Worse, the drained marshes turn into a toxic breeding ground for a catastrophic epidemic of dysentery. The unrelenting day and night duel of technology and pure physical endurance grinds forward without pause. The colossal bronze mouth of the bombard, the king's daughter, belches a blinding orange flash and a wall of black sulfurous smoke, hurling stone splinters deep into the town. The king's grand campaign is rotting from within as the bloody flux claims hundreds of lives, yet Henry stubbornly refuses to halt the bombardment. He commits his remaining healthy troops to a desperate, unyielding assault against the formidable fortifications, completely ignoring the mounting piles of dead that now litter the siege camp. English gunners concentrate their entire devastating artillery train on the massive timber and earth barbican guarding the western entrance. Day and night, the heavy stone spheres systematically shatter the outer wooden palisades, rendering the primary French defense mechanism unviable. Inside the town, citizens haul heavy baskets of clay and timber beams under cover of darkness to pack behind the crumbling masonry. Yet the relentless rhythm of the English cannons slowly chews through their nocturnal repairs, exposing the inner stone gatehouse to a terrifying, point-blank trajectory of absolute destruction across the field. The English War Council expects a swift French surrender, but what they receive instead is the overpowering stench of liquid rot. Within the camp, the groans of dying men drown out the noise of the artillery as dysentery ravages the highest echelons of leadership. Pale, skeletal soldiers shiver in muddy trenches, clutching their leather canteens while holding their abdomens in agony. The influential Bishop of Norwich dies in absolute misery, followed swiftly by the Earl of Suffolk. Thousands of elite longbowmen are rendered completely invalid, their trembling arms useless. Over 5,000 English combatants are now dead or entirely incapacitated by the devastating epidemic. The king sits rigidly on his campaign stool, staring blankly at a map smeared with wet mud and rain. Senior commanders and the king's royal brothers strongly urge Henry to board the remaining ships and return to England immediately. Henry refuses his council's desperate advice with cold, unyielding pride. He knows that a retreat by sea will destroy his domestic prestige, while across the walls, an exhausted de Gaucourt still clings to rescue. A coordinated, highly aggressive night assault permanently breaks the deadlock and destroys the final French defensive calculations. Under cover of pitch darkness, the Duke of Clarence's forces rush the outer ditch of the western gatehouse, carrying bundles of dry wood and straw. The charred, smoking wooden beams of the Leur Gate Barbican collapse into the outer ditch under the weight of stone fire arrows. The dry wood ignites rapidly into a roaring inferno. English men-at-arms rush the burning ramparts, driving the defenders back in a smoke-choked struggle and securing an irreversible foothold. The loss of the primary western fortification forces a catastrophic realization within the ruined walls of the town. Raoul de Gaucourt recognizes that further resistance will result in the utter slaughter of his tightly packed civilian refugees and garrison. A crisp, white linen flag is slowly hoisted above the battered stone parapet of the Leur Gate. The French commander requests an immediate parley with the English king. Henry, desperate to preserve what little remains of his disease-ravaged army, agrees to a conditional truce that hangs on a knife edge. The French royal army, gathering at Rouen, remains completely paralyzed by bitter domestic political rivalries. Armagnac and Burgundian lords argue fiercely over supreme command, fearing their rivals will seize Paris if they march to relieve the siege. A solemn procession of 24 bare-headed French knights in plain white shifts slowly emerges from the shattered gateway. The designated hour arrives on Sunday, September 22nd, without a single French banner appearing. They kneel in the deep mud, handing the heavy iron keys of Harfleur to the triumphant English king. King Henry V expects absolute submission from those he considers rebellious subjects. Over 2,000 fiercely loyal French citizens, including wealthy cloth weavers and salt makers, are systematically expelled from their homes with only the clothes on their backs. A long line of weeping women and children carries small bundles of clothes through the gate into the cold autumn drizzle. The siege of Harfleur 1415 has concluded, but the strategic victory is entirely hollowed out by a staggering human cost. Henry leaves a massive garrison to hold the ruined port. Would Henry V have faced complete political ruin and immediate domestic execution if his desperate march across the hostile countryside had not resulted in a tactical miracle? The siege of Harfleur 1415 stands as a critical watershed moment that introduced large-scale gunpowder artillery to English warfare, yet it nearly shattered the entire royal dynasty. Why does a meticulous logistics planner choose to swap his secure wooden decks for a grueling race across wet, mud-slicked northern fields? He leaves caution behind, marching his dying troops into the unknown. How did the brutal lessons of attrition, mud, and devastating disease at this Norman port shape the legendary tactical deployment of defensive archer stakes just 2 weeks later? The fields of northern France are no longer a neutral backdrop. They are a ticking clock, counting down to a catastrophic collision. French riders polish their heavy steel breastplates as they track the bedraggled English column winding through the sodden valleys. What happens when a proud, stubborn king dares a massive, vengeful French host to intercept his starving army in the open field? The successful capture of this vital maritime gateway permanently alters the territorial landscape of the Hundred Years' War. The bloody siege of Harfleur 1415 establishes an English-speaking fortress enclave that serves as a launchpad for future generations of continental conquest. A massive English banner unfurls from the central tower, casting a long shadow over the ruined rooftops below. Governor Raoul de Gaucourt endures years of harsh English captivity, while his town faces systematic colonization. This costly triumph sets the stage for the Battle of Agincourt, where a starving army must fight for survival. The road from Harfleur leads directly to a muddy field near Azincourt, where an outnumbered army must fight for survival. Subscribe to stay with this series. If you are watching on a television screen, the QR code on screen now will take you directly to the subscribe button on your phone.